To just support AOS student members leading up to the virtual AOS conference coming up from the 9th to the 14th of August in this coming summer. And so this is the first event in that 3-part series that's going to be focused on advice on abstracts. So all about tips for submitting successful student abstracts to conferences. So we have a great panel to give perspectives on this, from the scientific programming side of a conference to the specifically student presentation awards side, and just general perspectives from PIs who have helped a lot of students succeed at abstract submissions in the past. So I think, even though we're still missing Scott Rush, who's going to be one additional panelist, so if he arrives, we'll just let him hop right in. But for now, we were hoping for the 4 panelists that we do have. Well, I suppose, first of all, I should rewind and just say that my name is Maina Handmaker, and maybe Teresa and Jenny can introduce themselves. We're representing the monthly series subcommittee from the Student Affairs Committee of AOS. Teresa will be moderating the chat, so feel free to drop any questions at any point there. And with that, if our 4 panelists, if you guys could each introduce yourselves, we'd be grateful just to hear your involvement in AOS and what your research is focused on, and then we'll move on into the content of the panel. We can start, yeah, Ron, go for it if you want to start us off.
Sure. I'm Ron Mumme. I'm a professor of biology at Allegheny College. I'm in my 31st year at Allegheny College. I'm the chair of the scientific program committee for the meeting this year. And let's see, I've been an AOS member since 1975, if you can believe that. So pretty old school. I've been on a number of committees for the AOS, formerly the AOU, been on the AOU Council for a few times, but this is my first time being on the Scientific Program Committee, and much less chairing it. And my current research, I've been studying hooded warblers for a number of years, and that current research is focused on trade-offs between molt and parental care late in the season.
Great, thanks so much, Ron. Matt, do you want to go next? You're next on my screen.
Sure, thanks. So my name is Matt Carling, and along with Morgan Tingley, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Student Presentation Awards Committee, as well as the Student and Postdoc Travel Awards Committee. I've been an AOS member not quite as long as Ron, since 2003, 2002, something like that. My research focuses primarily on a variety of questions related to speciation adaptation. A lot of that work involves studying avian hybrid zones. I'm also the curator of vertebrates here at the University of Wyoming Museum of Vertebrates. And let's see, what else do I want to say? Oh, I guess I've been sort of in charge of Student Presentation Awards and Travel Awards since 2014. I think Morgan joined a couple years after that.
Great, thanks, Matt. Morgan, you're next on my screen if you want to introduce yourself.
Okay, so I am Morgan Tingley, and as Matt described, I am one of the co-chairs, along with Matt, of the Student Presentation Awards Committee. And so Matt and I and Jen Walsh kind of run the show when it comes to the Student Presentation Awards every year. And that includes things like sort of getting everyone's applications and making all the decisions about who participates in the competition, and then running the judging and all of that stuff. I don't know when I joined formerly AOU. I started going to conferences, I think 2008 was my first conference. And have pretty regularly gone, if not annually, every year since. I'm an associate professor at UCLA in ecology and evolutionary biology, and my research primarily focuses on how birds are responding, often across large spatial temporal extents, to climate change, is where most of my research lies.
Great, thanks, Morgan. And Jessica, you are our last panelist. Introduce yourself.
Great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Jessica Yorzinski. I'm an assistant professor at Texas A&M University in the Department of Ecology and Conservation Biology. And I'm relatively new to this society, but hoping to get more involved. So that's why I'm hoping to be able to give some advice here in this panel and other places. And my main work is focusing on sensory ecology, and we do a lot of work on avian vision in the context of mate choice and anti-predator behavior, among others.
Great, thank you all so much. Yeah, we're feeling lucky to have all of your perspectives. So the first section of the panel, just to give you a little review of what we'll cover, Ron is going to talk to us kind of from the perspective of the Scientific Programming Committee and what they look for when reviewing abstracts, especially looking towards this upcoming AOS meeting. And then after that, Matt and Morgan will talk to us more from the specific perspective of student travel awards and student presentation awards and what they look for in those abstracts. And after that, we'll open it up to questions. And a lot of you did submit questions in advance, so we'll go through those. And yeah, and if folks can just mute themselves, when not speaking, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. I think that should make it smooth for all of us. So take it away, Ron. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Maina. Yeah, the first thing I'd say from the perspective of the Scientific Program Committee is that at AOS meetings for many years now, there's always this tension between two forces that are going back and forth. First, most people who contribute abstracts to meetings would prefer to give a talk, okay? But at the same time, there's also pressure to reduce the number of concurrent sessions. And I think you can see why that's a little collision here, because everybody likes to give talks, most people like to give talks, but it's the number of concurrent sessions as it gets, you get more and more of them, you get fewer and fewer people able to attend each talk, and many more conflicts between talks people would like to attend. So that's the conflict that the Scientific Program Committee and the Meeting Coordination Committee faces every year, is trying to set the right balance of how many concurrent sessions can we have, which puts a limit on how many symposium presentations, how many contributed talks can be accepted. And so not every year, but many years, the Scientific Program Committee gets more proposals for oral presentations than we can really accommodate in the schedule. And so when that happens, we have to review them and make recommendations about which ones should be accepted as oral presentations. And the others are typically asked, hey, would you mind presenting this as a poster instead? And the main criteria that has been used in the past is largely based on the strength of the abstract and how much it conveys the fact that this is a finished product. And that is the typical bias that the Scientific Program Committee approaches that task with, in trying to determine which papers would be best for oral presentations and which would be better for posters. And so with that in mind, my advice I actually like giving posters. I think they're kind of, they're fun, and it's a great opportunity to talk with people individually. Obviously that works well at in-person meetings. And this year we've rethought the posters to try to recapture many of the positive things that happen at poster sessions at in-person conferences. But generally, if you have projects that are in process, that you have incompletely analyzed data, that you're not sure exactly what your story is, that's a perfect opportunity to submit a poster. That when you have a pretty finished product, that you might still be collecting some data, but the data are pretty well analyzed, what the story is, and you can write a really strong abstract. That's the situation when you can go for an oral presentation. But I think that's really the main bit of advice I can give from the scientific program committee perspective. I'm sure Matt and Morgan can pitch in because I think it's somewhat similar perspective from the Student Presentation Awards Committee as well.
Great, thanks, Ron. And yeah, I know that that was a big theme in the questions that came in from folks, is kind of that different tactics and different opportunities depending on what stage of completion your research is at, which is definitely a big factor for us students. So yeah, Matt and Morgan, however you want to split up, we got plenty of time, we're ahead of schedule. So sharing your thoughts from those committees that you serve on in terms of things to look for specifically for student abstract submissions.
Yeah, of course. So Morgan and I thought that it might be interesting to provide a little bit of context about how interest and participation in the Student Presentation Award competition has changed over the last 6-7 years or so. So again, I took over from Rebecca Kimball in sometime in 2014. The meeting in Estes Park in 2014, which is, I'm sure, well before all of your times, with the exception of Ron. So the 2014 meeting was in Estes Park, and that was the first time that I was in charge of Student Presentation Awards for AOS. That was prior to the merger of AOS and Cooper. And I felt really strongly at that time that we should try to accommodate as many students as we possibly could. And I was just going back through the numbers, and in 2014, we had 80 students apply to be part of the Student Presentation Award competition, and like 73 or 74 of them were allowed to participate. And the reason that 5, 6, 7 students or whatever weren't selected to participate at that point, it was because they didn't submit all the required information. That was the only kind of criteria that we looked for, was, did you submit all the information that we asked for? If so, we took all of those students. So in 2014, that was in the low 70s out of 80 that applied. 2015 was a small meeting, so I believe that was the last standalone AOS meeting. It was in Oklahoma, hosted at the University of Oklahoma. We had like 65 students apply to be part of the Student Presentation Award competition, and we took like 61 or 62 for the same reason, right? Some students just they submit an incomplete application, and we always have been big believers that you need to submit all the required information as sort of like the bare minimum to participate. But since then, interest in the Student Presentation Award competition has absolutely skyrocketed. I mean,
and student participation in conferences.
Yes,
they go hand in hand.
Yeah. And so AOS has put a lot of effort into trying to, I think, encourage students to attend AOS meetings. And from my perspective, I think that's awesome, and it's paid off in many, many incredibly positive ways. But with that massive increase in student participation, as Morgan was saying, we've seen a parallel increase in interest in Student Presentation Awards. So since 2014 to 2019, we've had about a 4.5-fold increase in the number of students that have indicated a desire to participate in the Student Presentation Award competition. So in 2019, let's see, I think I have this. In 2019, we had over 350 students that were interested in participating in the Presentation Award competition. So from 2014, we had 80. 2015, it dropped down to like 65, and now it's over 350. Last year, which is a little bit tricky because it was an NAOC, I think there were close to 570 students that said they were interested in participating in the Student Presentation Award competition. So on one hand, this is awesome. It's incredible, right? Students, the participation by students has really increased, and it's been great. Students, by and large, give great talks, and I almost always prefer hearing student talks or student posters than those given by mid-career and older folks like me and other people on this panel. Although Morgan still gives really good talks, so you should go listen to Morgan's if he ever gives one. But the problem is that when the numbers got this big, we simply could not absorb all of that sort of load on the competition. And there's a couple of really important factors that explain why that's the case. And I think this is really important for students to know. One is the logistics of scheduling all those presentations. And this more or less falls on, this year, Ron and his team, right? So we need all of the presentations that are going to be evaluated. We need them to finish considerably earlier than the meeting actually finishes. And we need to do that so we can collate all the evaluations and have a discussion about those students that are going to win awards and be given honorable mentions. We actually cut that as close as we can, but there's still an early deadline, earlier than the main conference finishes, by which we need to have all of those talks scheduled. So that's part of it. When we have in-person meetings, which 2022, the plan is to have in-person meeting in Puerto Rico. Then we also, there's an additional limitation from a scheduling standpoint, and that is we can't have too many student presentations at the exact same time, because that factors into sort of the other limitation, and that's the actual judging, right? So if we can't have people in the same place or in different places at the same time. With a virtual conference, it actually gives us a little bit more flexibility because judges can watch recordings of talks. And so we can assign one judge 2 talks that air live at the same time and ask that judge to evaluate one in real time and one in the recording, or they could evaluate both of them in the recording if that's what they want to do. So that's the sort of the talk and poster presentation scheduling side. But then there's also the limitation and the logistical challenges associated with finding judges and scheduling all those judges. So we can talk more about judging later and what the criteria are if folks are interested. But we have a minimum of 3 judges per presentation. And we ask judges to evaluate 5 to 6 presentations. Fewer than that, and it just becomes, the sort of comparison is tricky. More than that, judges won't want to do it if they have to do 10 or 12 presentations. So the number of judges and the scheduling and the sort of interaction between those 2 factors means that we can't accommodate all the students that we might want to, or all the students that want to participate. So we've had to introduce some selection procedures, and that's changed recently. And so Morgan's going to talk about that. And I think he also just dropped some information in the chat that will sort of supplement what he's going to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, I want to make sure that we try and stay on the topic of abstracts and how that plays in, but Matt and I thought this was important to mention because in our roles, we're trying to communicate this as clearly as possible to the students. And so we have been working, honestly, since AOSC ended, we've been working with the Diversity Inclusion Committee and the student committee at AOS about how we can basically best essentially revamp the selection process. And so the link that I dropped into the chat is sort of our new current revised information about the Student Presentation Awards, which we've added a ton more information this year to try and make the process as transparent as possible. And this webinar is not about the Student Presentation Awards. And so if you have questions, particularly about the awards, please reach out to us because we're happy to answer your questions. What I will say to try and bring it back around to what we were asked here to talk about is like, well, what is the role of your abstract in the Student Presentation Awards process? And so it's background to what Matt has talked about. We've spent a lot of time thinking about and working with focus groups about like how should we actually be choosing which students get to participate for awards and potentially compete for awards, and which students don't get to compete? And we sent a survey out actually to pretty much all of the AOS students and got decent returns back in the fall. And one of the things that we had thought was not a good idea, and that the students confirmed that they did not want, is that you don't want to be actually judged based off of your abstract. That is to say, that you don't want it to be treated as a sort of a pure meritocracy where the best abstracts get selected for competition, and the ones that are deemed as not as good don't get included in the competition. And Matt and I agree with that, and so we've long shied away from using that as a selection process, because we know that a lot of students, there's highly variable quality and quantity in the abstracts, particularly in terms of the advice and the mentorship you get given by your advisors or the rest of your lab about how to write abstracts. And so we've tried to not make decisions based off of that. And so from our point of view, whether or not if you want to be in the student awards competition, the quality of your abstract does not affect it. You have to submit an abstract, because you have to have an abstract submitted to actually register for the conference and to get a talk or a poster put in. But we won't be reading your abstract in the context of figuring out who gets to compete. Now, it could come into play into the extent that once your talk gets judged, the judges who are judging your talk, we don't tell them to go and rate your abstracts, but they very likely might read your abstracts beforehand before they go and see your talk or watch your poster. And so that could influence them. But I think in general, from our point of view, sort of the abstract is how you officially participate in the conference, right? You can't actually give a presentation unless you submit this abstract. And so the importance then is really about communicating to the broader body of people participating in the conference, and potentially people who missed the conference afterwards, about what work you presented and what you really talked about. Matt, do you agree with that?
Yeah, completely. The only small addition that I might add is that I think a lot of judges use the titles, and some of them use abstracts when determining, because we ask them for their preferences, right? Like, which ones might you be interested in evaluating? And so if your title and your abstract are good representations of the work that you're going to present, then I think you have a better chance of having a judge that's like really interested and really knows that field, rather than if it's sort of more general or more vague. It might be harder for a judge to know exactly what you're planning on presenting.
It is interesting. Every talk gets judged by the same number of judges, and we make sure there's no conflicts of interest, so people aren't being judged by their advisors or even by people that they're friends with. So we scrub all that stuff out, but we do ask the judges to basically list their top 14 preferences. And every year there's a pretty strong discrepancy. There are some talks that are just super popular, and there's some talks that aren't as popular. And I haven't done the stats. I actually don't think there's a very strong correlation between popularity and who actually wins, which is good. But I'm interested. I think there is something about like actually how compelling your title is, and to some extent your abstract, about who comes. And that's, I think, true not just for judges, but also like how many people show up to actually listen to your talk or see your poster.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of how we approach abstracts.
That was super helpful background to understand where the committees are coming from, especially with such an amazing increase in participation. So that does sound like a real challenge, and I think it's helpful for all of us as students to just hear, what's kind of happening behind the scenes in that decision process. So Matt and Morgan, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we kind of move into the question portion?
No, I think we have lots of thoughts on the questions, but nothing else on this exact topic.
Okay, perfect. So then what I think would be great to do is just, a lot of you submitted questions in advance. So what we'll do is we'll go through those. Some of them were overlapping, so I think they'll address each other. And then we can just open it up for live questions for folks that have new thoughts coming up. And this kind of ties in, hearing Ron talk about the challenges of, figuring out from abstracts how to logistically coordinate, where everything's going to fit in terms of the thematic or scientific program goals of the conference. And then, the student presentation side too, this question comes into play of, how do you decide how much and what background information is necessary to include in your abstract? And I know, Jessica, we haven't gotten to hear from you, so feel free to chime in, and any of the 4 panelists can answer this.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my initial thoughts would be that you really want to make sure people know what you're going to be adding to what's already known. So of course you want to set up the general background for your topic, but be sure to, I would think, really emphasize what you did, what you found, so you can get people excited about what the next steps are in that area.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to give a firm answer to this question. I just was reflecting on this myself. I wrote an abstract recently that I looked at it. Boy, the first half of it was all background, but it was necessary in that particular abstract. But then I've written other abstracts where one sentence is plenty for background. So it really depends on your topic, and that's probably the sort of thing where you can get a colleague to read it and give you some feedback on it. But I don't think it really is topic dependent. Some topics you just need more background, and the abstract is going to be pretty background heavy, but others you can cut right to the chase and start talking about what you found right away.
I think Ron's point is right to indicate that there's variability, like there's no hard and fast answer. I think in the context of students writing abstracts for conferences, the tendency is probably, your instincts are probably going to put in too much introduction. And the reason for that is because, for the most part, things aren't exactly wrapped up yet. And if the whole story is not finished, you haven't collected all the data yet, you haven't quite finished the analysis, you're going to be feeling nervous about the results and probably the discussion, essentially part of an abstract. And so therefore your tendency is going to be to front load it, to put in more background, to kind of hide what you sort of are uncertain about. And so I think that's where you might want to say, okay, like I don't need as much. When I teach like early undergrads about how to write abstracts, I do start with like a structure, and I introduce this idea of like an 8-sentence abstract. And if you actually look at conference abstracts, on average, they might end up being around 8 sentences. They might be 9 sentences, 10 sentences, 7 sentences, but they end up being around 8. And you can just kind of divide those 8 sentences into 2 sentences of introduction, 2 sentences of methods, 2 sentences of results, and 2 sentences of discussion. And like, yeah, you can break away from that formula. There's a wide variety, as Ron talked about, but like, that's a guideline that you can use that won't really go wrong. Like you won't be steered wrong if you try and use that type of formula, at least for the first draft in starting out. And you might have 3 sentences of results because you have lots of cool results. But like if you try and have those key sections of what would be a manuscript in the abstract, you're going to make sure that you're not really missing anything.
Well, building off of that, another question that we got was, how do you balance providing a thorough overview of your research while also enticing the reader to learn more? Which is, kind of, you guys were talking about using your abstract to draw more people to be interested in hearing your talk. And so how do you factor that into the balance of how much detail to include, showing the complexity or the excitement of your work without giving away the punchline, maybe? Or how much do you give away up front?
I mean, I don't think you need to spend a whole lot of time thinking about that. I mean, even if you were to spend, using Morgan's sort of 8-sentence structure as a guideline. Even if you're going to spend all 8 sentences on results, and they were super cool, I still think people would see those super cool results and want to come to your talk. And so I think that a well-balanced abstract, like everyone has said, is, will do its job of enticing people to come. I think what's more important is sort of like the clarity of the message rather than how much time you spend on, like results versus discussion or methods versus introduction. So honestly, I guess, like, if you really felt like you were struggling to put in all the amazing stuff that you wanted to, I would probably sacrifice methods in an abstract, especially for a meeting. But I think as long as you kind of hit all those points and have your message clear, I think that will do the trick of getting people interested. And the other thing then, and I can't remember if this was wrapped up in this question, or I know there's at least 1 or 2 other questions about titles. I'd say that, like, titles actually are important in this context, I think, of getting people to come to your talk. And so I think coming up with good informative titles, good is so subjective, but informative titles, I think, is important.
Well, on that note, one of the other questions we got was, is it okay to phrase the title of your abstract as a question?
Pretty sure that's okay from the scientific program committee.
I'm sorry, what was that, Ron?
As far as I know, that's totally fine, at least from the scientific program committee's perspective. So
I don't have a strong opinion either way. Actually, maybe I do have a strong opinion on this. I'll be curious to hear what Jessica or Morgan thinks. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it, but some people might have heard of Betteridge's law of headlines. Does anyone know what Betteridge's law of headlines is? And basically it's about, like, article headlines, right? But you can think of the title of a talk as more or less a headline for that talk. And this law of headline basically states that if a headline is phrased in the form of a question, the answer is no. Because if the answer was yes, you would have used a statement and not a question. And I think that actually holds fairly true for titles of talks and papers. You could come up with all kinds of examples in which it doesn't hold. But if you find yourself writing a question for a title and it's a yes or no question, if the answer is yes, turn it into a statement. If the answer is no, I would rewrite it so it's not that yes or no question. But other people may have thoughts on that.
I thought you were going to tell us that, like, the law was that we should just write titles that are essentially clickbait. Like, we should have the most clickbaity title as possible.
That's probably a different law of headlines.
The BuzzFeed law of headlines.
Right.
Well, this question is also related to one of the other questions, is that how do you write an abstract when you haven't analyzed the data? That, the question that could be viewed as a tip-off that, well, we don't really know the answer to the question at the time I'm writing the abstract.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that was probably the biggest theme in the questions that we got. So let's move on to that one. That was a good segue, Ron. So the kind of similar question came in different forms. How should the abstract be outlined if the results are not yet final, but we hope they will be by the time of the presentation? How to write an abstract for data that the analysis hasn't been completed yet. And this is a challenge when, the deadlines for submitting the abstract comes at a time when, we might be at the very early stages. So what are everyone's different thoughts on that challenge?
What I'll say first is that you're not alone. That, like, everyone deals with this, including professors, perhaps professors more than anybody, because we probably we don't actually have anyone above us telling us, oh, you have to finish this analysis before you submit the abstract. We're like, oh yeah, I'll just submit the abstract and I'll do the analysis 3 weeks or 3 days or something before the conference.
I'm shocked to hear that.
Not me, but I've heard stories, Ron. No, it's so, you're not alone. Like, everyone's in the same thing. And this is really one of the fundamental differences between writing an abstract for a conference and writing an abstract for a paper. Like, obviously, by the time you submit the paper, everything's done. So I don't know how to do it. I'll let others talk first.
I mean, Morgan's absolutely right. Everybody does this, and I was totally faking about my shock because I've done it myself. But I will say, when you are in this position, this is when your self-editor should kick in and says, maybe this should be a poster if it's really not in the state where I have even thoroughly analyzed the data, because that's exactly what posters are for. If when you've got a project that's not quite complete, this is a great way. A poster is a great way to organize your thoughts, get some informal feedback from people, and that's really if you find yourself in that situation, that's how do I write this abstract when I haven't analyzed the data? And I will point out, we still have 2 weeks, so you do have 2 weeks of analysis that you could do before submitting the abstracts. But if it's still a little uncertain, you still have one big field season coming up to collect the data, that's when you might think, well, maybe I'll do it as a poster this year and then try to do the oral presentation on it next year.
I will say that there is a difference between having not started the analysis and knowing that the analysis is not finished. And so, like, don't let imposter syndrome tell you not to submit the abstract just because you know that the analysis is not fully in its final version yet. Like, if you've done the analysis and you have results, and those results, and like you can know what those results are, then yeah, by all means.
Yeah, and kind of leading off what Morgan is saying, perhaps you have part of your analysis done. Maybe you already know a few of the results, and you can try to emphasize that in your abstract and kind of leave the rest for in a few months down the road when you actually present it, because you can still talk about things in your talk even if they didn't exactly appear in your abstract. So focus on what you do know now and add later might be another approach.
Yeah, I think anybody who's given talks has written abstracts that were true, but then the actual papers that we deliver are very different because subsequent analysis. So there was even cooler stuff that we did not know was there, and that's totally fine. But when you do write your abstract, you definitely do at least some analysis so that you can make it clear that you do have some results, and everybody understands they can change as additional data come in, but I think that's probably the best way to approach it.
Yeah, I've had excellent advice from everyone. Maybe to sort of take a little bit of a step back and simplify, I think whatever you have at that point is fine to include, right? If you've collected data on 52 birds, right? And you have something about those data. What kind of data are they? Song data, morphology, who knows, nest visitation data. Like, if that's all you have, then at least put that in there. And again, everyone knows that this happens to everyone at least once, and some of us it happens to repeatedly. So just take whatever you have. Don't like make stuff up, but just put in what you have. And I think everyone understands how, kind of how this process works, because it happens to all of us.
And if you're looking through abstracts, you'll see what people do, which is that imagine you have data on 52 birds and it's provisioning rate or something. And that, or maybe you have the data, but you haven't analyzed it, you don't know anything. It's the abstract reads something like, we collected data on provisioning rate for 52 birds and analyzed, how provisioning rate varied as a function of daily max temperature. The effects of like daily temperature on provisioning rate will be discussed. There's usually some line like that in the abstract where the person's like, we're going to talk about this. I have no clue what I'm going to say because we don't know, but we will talk about this as the focus of this talk.
So kind of building off of this, we've talked about trying to recognize yourself, okay, what stage am I at with this research? And if I'm still at the very preliminary question asking phase, maybe I'm going to submit as a poster instead. When you're making that decision, recognizing the stage your own research is at, what would your recommendations be about, are there different things that the committees look for if it's an abstract for a poster versus an abstract for a talk, in terms of the tactics for engaging the audience, or kind of setting it up for the different goals of those, like inviting feedback during a critical kind of question forming phase versus after results have been coming through? What are the different thoughts you'd go through for those different types of abstracts?
That's a good question, and I think everyone recognizes that this projects that are in the development stage or very early on, that's exactly what posters are for, and certainly the abstracts for those kind of projects. Thinking about the Morgan's 8 sentences, they can be definitely skewed heavily toward background and objectives, and but that's totally fine, absolutely fine for posters, and because that is the venue really for trying to get feedback on the work that you're doing, that's work in progress. And just telling you what the scientific program committee has done in at least as many years as I can remember, depending on the size of a conference, sometimes not everybody who wants to do an oral presentation can be accepted, but anybody who wants to deliver a poster will be accepted. And so do the poster in a way that gets the objectives that you want. Because if you're at the stage of a project where you want some feedback on what your objectives are, you want to devise the poster to reflect that, rather than more emphasizing on that, rather than maybe non-existent results that you don't have yet, or you might have some of by the time the conference is delivered. But the posters are definitely, I guess we would think of the posters as a more formative exercise, and an oral presentation is maybe a little more summative. I guess that might be a way to try to think about them.
Well, if there aren't other thoughts on that question, one to build off of that, Ron, you were talking about how a big challenge for the scientific programming committee is figuring out where each accepted talk will fit into the schedule. So are there different strategies that you would recommend based on what you look for to try to decide where a presentation or a poster would fit, in terms of keywords or ways to kind of highlight specific to the conference program where you think your research might fit? Or is that always left up to the committee?
It's such a huge jigsaw puzzle, and Matt and Morgan mentioned two of the big pieces, is that we have to schedule all the the talks for candidates for student presentation awards have to be scheduled early. And so and then you like to try to group similar presentations together in a particular session, so it has some degree of coherence. I don't think it's such a wild crapshoot. I just wouldn't even worry about it. Sometimes you get lucky and you get, I remember my first student presentation, I was the first talk of the meeting. And then other times you get the last talk of the meeting, and it's just pure luck as to how stressed out the scientific program committee is in trying to pull all these pieces together. I don't think there's really much you can do about that. It's just it's going to be what it is, unfortunately.
But Ron, I'm not sure about the current abstract submission, but in the past, usually everyone is required to essentially classify their abstract into different areas, and they have to give like up to 3 classifications, right?
That's correct. And we revised that this year. I think there were like 48 different categories last year, and based on advice from last year's scientific program chair, said that was way too many. It really didn't help. It actually hindered grouping talks together rather than help. So we cut it down to, I think it's like 18 or 19 this year. And that's, so do put some thought into that if you are contributing. Either we're going to try to group posters together in some way too. So posters with similar themes will be sort of next to each other on the program, so that'll provide some coherence to the poster program. So it is important to do that, but as to exactly whether you're on the first day of the meeting or the last day of the meeting, there's just no way to know that.
Unless if you're in the student presentation committee, or if you're in the student presentation competition, you're usually not on the last day. Because we plead and bribe the coordinators and schedulers to have those students earlier in the conference.
Or if you are on the last day, Matt and Morgan will send me hate mail, and I do not want that to happen.
It might be the judges have to do that.
So we have 2 more questions that were pre-submitted, and then if we have time, we can open it up. So if folks out there are thinking of questions now, feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat. One question, just kind of zooming out to the nuts and bolts about best practices. What are the expectations or the rules about whether you should cite in your abstract or reference kind of foundational research prior to that you built off of?
My personal opinion is that it's generally unnecessary, but I don't think anyone's going to bat an eye if you do it.
Oh, there's no room for actual citations.
Right, in the online submission. I mean, it would be counted as towards whatever the word limit or character limit is for the submission. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty rare to have citations in abstracts generally. I think about the only time it would come up if you were, if there was one specific study where you got very different results from that, and a lot of your talk might be focused on that. But it's, I think, generally speaking, never cite anything in your abstract unless it's a real particular case.
Sometimes you'll see like aggressive abstracts where it's like someone got really, really upset by Mumme et al. 2019. And so the abstract is like, Mumme et al. 2019 wrote this thing about hooded warblers that we thought was terrible. And so this abstract, this entire talk is a refutation of Mumme et al. 2019. So sometimes you'll see that, but presumably that's not what any of you are doing. So yeah.
I haven't
a real
responded to
specialty of
Morgan's
Morgan's
paper on that yet. So.
Did you have something to add to that, Matt?
I was just saying, writing an aggressively worded abstract is one of Morgan's tactics. It's how he's become so successful as an ornithologist.
It's why you think my talks are so entertaining, is because mostly I'm just ranting about other people.
Yep.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. That's one strategy. So the last question that we had pre-submitted is a good one. What are the biggest mistakes that you see in abstract submissions?
I feel like that's a question for Ron.
Yeah, and I'm actually new in this role as chair of the scientific program committee, so I haven't seen these. The one that I was going to suggest was, and Morgan already touched on this, was when I was in grad school, whenever we read an abstract, and they often ended with, the significance of these results will be discussed, you know. Those, you've got a 1,750 character limit, and including spaces, so that comes down to about 250 words. So I think the main thing is to make those 250 words count in whatever way that works best for you, and whether that follows strictly to Morgan's 8-sentence model, or how it departs from that, but really try to make them count, I think, is the best way to approach it.
Yeah, I think Ron, building off what Ron said, you know, I think one of the dangers, one of the essentially the mistakes, is that you could essentially fall victim to imposter syndrome in saying that, like, oh, I don't know enough about this yet to be able to put in a meaningful discussion sentence into this abstract. Like, I don't know enough yet to actually say what the implications are going to be. And I think usually you do, like because you know what the implications are, otherwise you probably wouldn't have done the study in the first place. And so my suggestion is you probably know more than you're giving yourself credit for. And so that you have the ability to make that abstract more effective and more compelling.
That seems like a good way to sum up some tips, is to don't sell yourself short and to make your limited number of words count. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask live? You can unmute yourself, or you can drop it in the chat and Teresa will field questions. While we're waiting for folks, in case anyone thinks of additional questions, first of all, thank you so much to Ron, Matt, Morgan, and Jessica. And we can repost it in the chat, but if you scroll up, maybe Jenny or Teresa can repost it. But just as a reminder, this panel was the first of a 3-part series, and the next 2 will kind of build off of this, all leading up towards the conference in August. So the next one is going to be on May 3rd from 4 to 5, and you'll get emails about this from AOS, so keep an eye out on your inboxes. That one is called Conference Considerations, and we'll be getting advice from panelists on, now that so many conferences are available to us virtually, how do you choose which ones to attend, and how to make the most of them in the virtual format, attending live versus watching recordings, strategies for virtual networking, and things like that. And then the third event is going to be in mid-July, or July 21st, also from 4 to 5 Eastern. And it's called Interacting with Your Invisible Audience, which I think is a big challenge of virtual conferences. And that panel will be focused on everything from technical considerations, like avoiding snafus, like accidentally leaving your screen in presenter mode, or having your video tile cover up a key graph on your slide, or creative ways to still engage with attendees of your talk and really making your slides dynamic, even though you don't have that chance to interact with folks in person. So stay tuned and please register for those. We'd love to have you there. And other things coming into the chat is for conference considerations. Maybe you don't even need to attend our next panel, because Morgan summed it up as always attend the AOS meeting. And we're getting another question. Can you link the details for the July workshop? Yeah, those were just posted just a minute ago in the chat, but we'll send out a summary email after this, right, Jenny, that will have a recap of all those. Anyone else have any questions for our very helpful panel? I guess a big thing to remind everyone is that the deadline for abstract submissions for the AOS meeting is coming up on April 15th. So we tried to time this panel to give you a little time to incorporate these tips.
And I will say that if you want to participate in the student presentation competition, after you submit your abstract, you have to go back and submit a second application, which is all through the same portal. It's all through the same portal, but it's a different application, which is different from last year. In previous years, it all used to be one combined thing, but now it's a separate application afterwards.
And I believe you need your abstract number, right, Morgan?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think an email just got sent out to the AOS student list with the detailed instructions for that.
And I just say, yeah, the abstract deadline is April 15th. And if anyone has questions, feel free to send me an email. I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Yeah, panelists, feel free to drop your email in the chat too, or if you're comfortable with it, we can include your contact in the summary email when we.
Yeah, you can include it. You can, I mean, my email and Morgan's email is everywhere in the student presentation award stuff.
Yeah, they're already on the AOS website, but just so everyone can find everything in one place.
Right. You can follow Morgan on Twitter too.
Thanks.
That should probably be in our panel on conference considerations. It's certainly where to find a lot of good information about opportunities. So
I will say you can decide whether or not to follow Morgan, but you should follow Morgan's. I forget what it's called. Like your like bird quiz. What's it called?
The bird of the day?
Yeah, bird of the day. You should check out bird of the day if you don't know about bird of the day. You
Every
should
day
check that
it's a
out.
different bird. If you see it, that's a great day for you. And with each bird of the day, we also tweet out a fact about that bird.
I need Morgan as my social media advisor, apparently.
Well, thank you so much, Ron, Matt, Morgan, and Jessica. And if no one else has any questions, we hope you'll join us for the upcoming panels and hope this was a helpful one leading up to the abstract submission deadline. We're really glad to have you all here and look forward to seeing you at the AOS meeting in August. So
I'll look forward to seeing everybody's abstracts. Thank you.
All right,
Thanks
thanks for having us.
thank you.